All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending the, what is this month, February meeting of the Urbana Sustainability Advisory Commission meeting. Scott, will you call the roll, please? Thank you. Present.
Morgan White.
Here.
Here.
Scott, I don't know if your mic was on. I couldn't hear you, but Grace is here remotely.
All right, we'll go ahead and proceed with what is on the agenda this evening. I know, I just don't have the screen up yet. So a part of your packets that you received ahead of this meeting were the minutes from the December 5th, 2023 meeting. Is there a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
Thank you. Second.
I will second that.
Excellent. Are there any requested discussions or changes to those minutes? All right, all in favor of passing the minutes, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries. Thank you. Next, we move into the public input section of our meeting this evening. Would anybody in the audience wish to address the commission? All righty. It's going to be a really quick meeting tonight. What I'll go ahead and do is, since we're really just going to be short on our presentations this evening, we are going to have a staff report from Scott Test from the city. Afterwards, I'll just see if anybody in the audience has any questions that they would like to ask from the staff report that might make some better notes, since I'm sure that you're here from a class. All right, Scott, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to go through a staff report, and then I'm also going to go quickly through a bunch of slides just talking about kind of a view of the year ahead. So just the traditional staff report first. Oop. Attached properly. There it is. So an update on the two new fire stations that the city is building. After some council goals making sessions, council did agree to move both fire stations to a geothermal baseline condition, or the standard starting condition for the fire stations is going to be geothermal powered. So that's great. Those fire stations are at 50% complete plans, and there's the engineering team still continues to move forward in developing those plans. There will probably be some changes here and there, but we do expect that the offices and living quarters are going to be geothermal powered. It may be that the apparatus bays, the garage where the fire trucks go, are not geothermal powered, but rather just gas fired. And the reason for that is when those doors come open in those garages, they lose pretty much the entirety of the conditioned air. And for geo to bring that back up to temperature would take a long time. So we're going to just bring those back up to temperature quickly with natural gas heating. Those are scheduled to start construction in 2025. We'll also proceed with collecting 12 months of utility bills at both of those fire stations once they're occupied, and then we'll size and bid out a rooftop solar installation. So there'll be geo and solar. Any questions on that?
So have you thought about, since you'll have natural gas, you actually have to hook up to the natural gas line, that expense that's
It's
the equation?
It's a consideration that we discussed early on. There is natural gas service at the at the parcels already, So you're only adding natural gas service from the street to the building. If it were the edge of town and you had to run natural gas infrastructure, a half a mile, that might change the calculation. But I think that's considered a smaller consideration.
I'm just thinking because you have to actually pay a charge to be hooked up.
True.
That's not a small amount.
True.
And would you be doing air conditioning as well?
No, they're not. They're not cooled. They're only heated. Yeah. Yep.
Question. And then were you going to do any tax credits?
Yes, we will be pursuing. I'll mention that in the quick slides, but we'll be pursuing the 30% elective pay for all these projects.
And we talked about having it be like solar ready. Is that still the plan?
Yes, yeah. There is every expectation. The design is with the expectation that there will be rooftop solar on these. So there's a broad south-facing pitch on both of these buildings.
On the tax credits, have you started looking at how to get the I believe since it's a city building, it would be prevailing wage, right?
Correct.
So the, there's an additional incentive on the Investment Recovery Act tax credits if you have, in this case, it'd be 15% of the labor for the geothermal installation to be from an apprentice. And there's tracking of that. One of the things that from the U of I side we're trying to do is encourage more apprentices because it's hard to get 15% of the labor from an apprentice. And apprenticeships in that program, in the crafts and trades, they graduate. So we bring them in and then they graduate. It's sort of like all the other students in the community. But this one, we need to be encouraging people to be apprentices. So I'm wondering if you'd done anything in that area yet or started conversations about that.
So is the apprenticeship incentive separate from the prevailing wage incentive?
You have to have both to get that extra incentive, which I forget what it was. It was
And
like another 10%.
I think that only applies if it's above a certain scale, which we are not above. Below that scale, you just get that percent.
Okay, I think
So in that sense, I think it's actually a penalty if you don't do it and it's a large project. Does that sound familiar?
No. But I also don't have it memorized. I know that there's a certain piece at the small scale that is, you don't have to do other things, but
Something to look into for sure.
Check into that, yeah.
Yeah.
And there is a level of ask for the apprentices, like really try, and then if you can't get the full 15%, it's possible that the IRS would still allow the credit, the additional credit, showing if you have the good faith effort shown, but there's not currently, from my understanding, there's not currently a clear definition of what that good faith effort looks like. So
Sure.
I encourage you to start trying now.
Sure. Yep. We'll look into that. We are making. Sorry? Oh, sorry.
I didn't know if you could hear.
Oh, hey, Grace. Yes, we hear you.
Hi. I had a question about fire station as well. I was wondering if there was conversations about additional design kind of efficiency, green building principles. I know we weren't going for LEED certification by any means, but there's some material and design choices that could be little or no additional cost. I didn't know if those were part of the conversation.
I can follow up on that. I think we are code plus geo and solar. I think that's where we're at right now.
Okay. So if you have a chance to chime in along the way, I would encourage to look into things like, just the orientation of windows for daylight and passive solar heating in the building and insulation and non-volatile materials for the inside. And there's a lot of LEED principles that I think can be considered for, again, little or no additional cost when you're building from scratch anyway.
Yes. And that, now that I think about it, I think because of some site conditions at one of the sites, they were looking at doing underground storm chambers. That's more expensive typically than just digging a hole for stormwater retention, but there was some other reasons that made that more attractive at one of the sites. So they have been looking at that.
Great, thank you.
I'm looking back at our old notes. Is it going to be battery ready in addition to the solar ready, or none of that yet? No EV plans?
No. We don't anticipate. So in terms of fleet electrification, the fleet vehicles at a fire station are probably last in line to be electrified, just because they're the bigger, more complicated pieces. So that's not really in the plans. Also, battery prices are still fairly high. The grid is a battery too. We can actually overproduce during the day and then take that off the grid later on at night. So the grid is a battery, and we're already paying for the grid. So it's a reliable battery. It lasts forever, whereas a battery has a lifespan.
You could always use the electrified trucks as batteries.
When that technology it's going to happen, but it's we'll see when that happens. All in due time.
I'm not sure if we've ever talked about this, but when you were mentioning how when the full door opens up, it like lets out all of the heat and stuff. Do you know if they've ever looked into designing like a smaller room for the fleet vehicles, like just the vans and stuff that go out, or the fire marshal?
I think so in the fire stations we have now, I think the only vehicles that are inside are the ladder trucks, the apparatus. I don't think that there are trucks, SUVs, or ambulances, and the city does not own an ambulance service. I don't think any of those are they're not in our fire stations now. I don't know that they would be in this future fire station either. So it's going to be the large overhead doors most likely.
Yeah, I've seen the ambulance in the fire station before.
Have you?
It's not all the time.
Yeah.
There, but
We are moving forward this year with a fourth round of bulk geothermal purchase program called Geothermal Urbana Champaign. We expect that the Geothermal Alliance of Illinois won't be partnering with us this year, so we'll be making other arrangements. We've invited the Midwest Renewable Energy Association to participate again. They helped design the program in year one, but exited in years 2 and 3. So they are considering that. So we'll see. But we're intent on running that program again and decarbonizing more heating and cooling in the 3-county area that is our market area. There's been some progress on a regional biodiversity plan at the University of Illinois. That effort is being led by the Extension Service. That's really exciting. Urban biodiversity is something that in small ways here and there Urbana has been doing for a long time, and we support that and really look forward to seeing that comprehensive view of the whole region with an eye to expanding urban biodiversity. Along those lines, the state climatologist, Trent Ford, is exploring the possibility of a regional grant application that would do some work similar to what Urbana had done a few years ago by creating a heat map of ground temperature, land surface temperature. They would actually be, they're interested in deploying people and taking actual readings, whereas we used satellite land surface temperature. And so that would be really interesting. We'll give them a little bit of support insofar as we're able to. But it'd be really great for the other communities to be able to have that data set as we enjoy it and be able to plan. We're using it for street tree plantings, but there's maybe other applications for that as well. We also intend to run another round of our bulk solar purchase program, Solar Urbana Champaign. We will be partnering with the Midwest Renewable Energy Association on that. This will be our 9th year of that bulk purchase program.
Scott, do you have a comparison of other places that have used? I know this was originally launched with some support from the Department of Energy Sunshot program, right?
No, we didn't.
It was not connected?
We did apply for that at one point in the past, but we were not awarded.
Okay, thank you. The question I have is about other places that are doing a similar program. I remember how incredibly successful the very first year was, and I'm really glad that it's still going. And I think that, anyone who hasn't done it yet needs to do it now, and we'll keep going. And hopefully it can just keep going and going and going. But I think that I'm curious if we should be using this success story to incentivize more participants, because I know we talk about it's going really well. 9th year is a really big deal, but we know that people choose. I've learned that people like to join the winning team. So to say, we're one of the most solar, installations of solar in the blank in central Illinois or in the whole state or in the Midwest or whatever it is, would be really great to know. So I was curious if you have some comparisons at this point.
One can scour the internet and get a sense of other municipalities that have a program and how many years, but it's pretty difficult to get visibility on actual solar installations. So just take Urbana, for instance. We have data on our program, but up until a few years ago, there was no recording of solar installations. They were just an electrical permit and a building permit. There was no recording that this was a solar installation. That changed with some new software we had a few years ago that we implemented. But other municipalities are undoubtedly the same. Some are tracking every solar installation they know, and some don't, and then getting the data out. So it's not easy to say we have the most as a blanket statement, or we're second or 12th or anything like that. When I looked several years ago, there was not any programs that had this kind of year-on-year longevity. There were a few programs that had some bumper years like we had in the first year. And then, of course, when Solar Chicago or Grove Solar Chicago, I think last year, the year before, when that restarted after their first year, about 10 years ago, actually, of course, they had an enormous amount of solar installations because they're, a metro area of 3 million or whatever it is, whereas we're a metro area of 250,000. So we can kind of scale it on that by comparing to other Grove Solar or MREA Grove Solar programs, because they collect data similar to we do. That's a pretty good comparison. On a per capita basis, I think we're still doing more than the Chicago area, but I'd have to take a look at those numbers again. But we definitely promote this as a long-running program. We use consistent branding. People, there's a certain familiarity. People come to solar power hours for several years, sometimes before conditions are just right for them in their household to add solar. People hear about it for years before they ever come to a solar power hour. So there's a lot of brand recognition and longevity that we're leveraging.
Thanks.
And the last thing on here is UCycle will be bringing a resolution to approve an intergovernmental agreement to fund 2 electronic waste collection events, recycling events, along with the other municipalities in the county in this area. We're just one of several cooperating governments working on this. Normally, or I should say last year, we brought a resolution and an IGA for electronics and HHW, household hazardous waste collection. But the state had some problem with moving forward with that program, which they're a huge funding source for that household hazardous waste collection. So that's postponed. If I remember correctly, I think they maybe didn't get any bids on the actual collection event. There was some procurement barrier, I think. And so we're just moving forward with the electronics waste collection at this time. It's been great to have household hazardous waste collection events every year for, I think, like 3 years in a row, primarily funded by the state. They are expensive, something on the order of $100,000 an event. Most of that is just disposal costs. The locals pick up some of the ancillary event costs. But it's really important. And we'll talk more about HHW in this PowerPoint I'm going to pull up. Any other questions on this? Okay. All right. So what I want to do is just rapid fire go through this real quick and talk about some things we're going to be doing and some things we've investigated and maybe are not going to be doing. First is municipal electric aggregation. That price is going to have a partial reset. One part of the price that is floating on the market is going to reset in July. So that price will adjust up or down a little bit in July, and then that the contract ends in December. So we will be going out to bid again in December. On electric vehicles and the electrification of our fleet, we had, and I mentioned here before, we had solicited vendors to who we would offer a site license, the ability to use our city parking spaces for EV charging that they would install, own, operate, charge, collect fees, decommission. We had only one vendor that was interested. Their program was dependent on winning a federal grant, which they did not win, and so that effort has ceased. Essentially, there's not enough money to be made to cover the cost and operation of EV charging in public spaces. So that is moving forward in places where it is market, like a gas station, because gas stations make money on the shop more than they do the gasoline and, more and more every day the electricity that they sell. But gas stations are moving forward with EV charging, for instance, Casey's, and so we're gonna cease that effort for the time being until some conditions change. We also spoke with a local electrician to get a sense of scale as to what it would cost to put electric service in at a city facility to electrify our fleet, specifically the Public Works facility. And that came in somewhere on the order of $100,000 to $200,000 just to get the electrical service there. So that doesn't include the charging stations themselves, the pylons or whatever you want to call them. Those, if you buy a cheap one that doesn't have any technology and isn't secured, could be $50. But if you want one that's secured and has tracking and data and all that, you're probably talking about $500. So that's a significant investment. Fleet electrification is certainly something that we're interested in, and it's going to happen someday. But it's a heavy lift to get that infrastructure in up front. One thing that is nice that has come along with some of the recent federal legislation is there is a public sector incentive equal to up to $7,500 on EV purchases. So that substantially addresses the price differential between a conventional and an EV, but we're still left with the significant upfront purchase in terms of electrifying the parking lot.
Scott, I am familiar with the state of Illinois' EV rebate program as well, but what I'm less familiar with is whether or not the state of Illinois has an EV charging station program or rebate, and whether or not that was part of the bid. And if it doesn't exist, then no, but does that exist? Are you aware of it?
I'm not aware of an incentive that would apply to our city parking lot. The state has a electrification plan essentially along the interstates, which is federally funded. They've submitted their plan. It was approved. And those are, I don't know if individual sites are picked yet, but those are going to be built out. So, you know, in terms of traveling out of town, that's substantially addressed with federal and state action. Of course, you know, there's 10,000 to 14,000, private household garages in Urbana. So that's 10,000 to 14,000 EV charging stations right there. I expect most people will charge their car like they charge their phone, which is at home overnight. That's probably where most charging is going to happen. But we've gotten a sense of scale of what this costs, and that's important because now we know what we're talking about, and we will keep an eye on this to see when the opportunity might be right to make an investment and start that transition to electrified fleet.
Just thinking ahead about potentially solvable problems, maybe this is insane, but I could foresee a future where the city might consider allowing staff to take home the vehicles that, if they're electric vehicles, take home and charge at home and provide kind of the electricity rebate for charging at home overnight or something like that, especially if there isn't enough charging infrastructure on site. And then that kind of also gets at the homeowner doesn't have to take their vehicle, their personal vehicle that might still be gas, maybe they don't have an electric car, back to the office the next day and kind of, I don't know, putting it out there. There's all sorts of ways to sort of overcome whether or not we can have charging stations or enough of them for the fleet at the facility where they need to be. Again, using the grid as the battery. The beauty of the electric vehicle is that you can charge with a plug that has a plug.
I see the virtue in what you're describing. There are complications. One would be if something electrical goes wrong, the car and the garage burn down. Now, who's paying for that and whose fault is it and everything else? So we'll see. I don't anticipate action on this in the near term, but we have a sense of scale, and that's important. The image here on the top of the image is the city's new storage facility that was completed, I think, last year. And that has a nice, large, south-facing roof. And we have maybe a budget amendment. It might have gone yesterday. I'll have to double-check. But we have a budget amendment going to council to fund a solar array through the CIP, the Capital Improvement Plan, for this facility. It's not a big energy user, but it's a brand-new roof. And we have one of those now in our city facilities. So we want to, we've collected 12 months of bills, and we want to get this facility solar powered. And then as we move to the other buildings in the Public Works campus, working through our facilities master plan, doing remodelings and repairs, as those roofs are replaced, we're going to follow those with 12 months of utility bills because the electrical demand is going to change. And then a rooftop solar installation through a competitive bid process there.
If you can't use all of the power that's generated on site at that building, does Ameren allow for you to credit the power that's made in one location and credit it to a bill like for the city building?
It would have to be 2 buildings with 1 meter. No, you can't take credits from one building and put them on another, even though you're the same account or the same payer.
Yet. Not yet.
So Andy had brought this up earlier. These projects, we are going to pursue the 30% or thereabouts elective pay, often incorrectly called direct pay. That does mean that the city is going to have to learn how to file taxes. Obviously, it's not something we've ever done before because we're not a tax-paying body. But that's a new task, and it's not it's not nothing. There is a pre-application website, and then you have to file taxes at the end of tax year. So that's a thing that we're going to have to do. But obviously, it's worth the money, so we're going to have to find time for it. Of course, everyone has heard about the enormous amount of investment in sustainability with the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. There are some interesting opportunities there. We have, Public Works has sought to staff a grant writer in Public Works. That hasn't happened yet. Engineering has been understaffed for a few years. They are, I think, at full staff now, but now the Arbor Division, who I was looking for some grants for, has lost staff. And so it's very difficult to pursue $250,000, $500,000, multi-million-dollar grants with, just what little time we can cobble together. I am personally interested in some opportunities. There is a really excellent opportunity that's transpired whereby some nonprofits in Illinois have applied for large tranches of federal grant money with the expectation and understanding that they will sub-grant those to others in Illinois who would not have to do all the extensive federal grant applications and monitoring. And that's great. So it's making the federal dollars available in a much easier to get at way. I'm really interested in that, and I'm struggling to find time to get at it. We're interested in this money, but at this point, we really need more staff to be able to pursue it. Speaking of the Arbor Division, this is a screen capture of our map of all of our street trees. We have something like 10,000 or 11,000 planted street tree sites and just under 4,000 vacant tree sites, so just under 4,000 opportunities to add new street trees. We are, for the first time ever, exploring hiring a vendor through a competitive bid process to do tree pruning. We keep losing our arbortechs to other municipalities, and putting some of the proactive cyclical pruning on a vendor might be advantageous. So we're waiting on bids to see how that's going to go in terms of price. Now, just because a vendor is doing it doesn't mean that doesn't require staff time. Vendors have to be managed, have to be supervised. So we're gonna try that process, and if it goes well, that may be an activity that we can expand with one of these grants in the future. So I'm really interested in that. I know you all have heard me talk about the need to get our proactive cyclical tree pruning back to a 7-year cycle, as is the best practice in the industry. That makes the trees live longer and keeps large branches from falling on people's heads and cars.
What, the strong storms that we have here aren't taking care of it?
It's certainly brought some trees down. Or some large branches. I lost power for 3 days. Not this recent one, but last year. We are still working towards a second landfill solar development. Right now, we are only considering that southeastern green splotch there. We have selected, and I've talked about this before, we have selected a vendor. They have paid for an interconnection study. They're doing paying for the geotechnical work, and they have applied for a place in line for a market rate community solar incentive. So at this point in time, we're just waiting for our number to come up in the state incentives. When we get through that, we may reassess what amount of land we have, what balance of land we have on the landfill, and do this process for a third time and keep building out as much of this land as we can to some productive use. Use Cycle is prepping bids for the end of our two big contracts, one being curbside recycling collection, the other being multifamily recycling collection. Those contracts both end in April next year. Because they are big services and 5-year terms, we tend to publish them the fall or the quarter 4 of the year before. So we're working on that. UCycle is also working with the product stewardship organization in the state. Their priority this year is getting product stewardship for battery recycling. So you may know that Urbana provides, I think it's 4 or 5 locations for drop-off locations for battery recycling, AA, AAA batteries, that sort of thing. And so there's an effort to create a product stewardship system for those sorts of batteries as well. And that may result in more or different drop-off locations in Urbana, but it would most certainly provide funding for that collection and recycling. So we spend about $10,000 a year on that program, so that would give us some financial relief. And that's all funded by the users. So, for instance, we have paint stewardship that's just starting in Illinois. There's going to be something like a several dollar charge when you buy a can of paint, but then when you have leftover paint, the recycling is already paid for. You get to drop off paint for recycling at no additional charge. So this would be a similar situation. The Champaign County environmental stewards continue to move forward with a household hazardous waste collection facility. They were successful at getting some federal money through the cities that allowed them to purchase a property for this facility, so that's great. They are now looking at something on the order of a $2 million construction project, and they'll also have operating expenses when that facility starts, and the city may be asked to contribute to the capital and the operating costs. Courtney Kwong, the recycling coordinator, and myself both think that household hazardous waste is a very high priority, especially in terms of waste and recycling. We recycle glass, but glass is not toxic. Meanwhile, we don't have a system for, other than our what's been a once-a-year collection event, we don't have a system for properly managing all of these household hazardous wastes, which may very well be toxic, many of them are. So we think that's a really high priority and a good use of public funds. I've got an image here of the International Code Council. We recently adopted a new international codes, building code, electrical code, and we voluntarily accepted a voluntary annex to the code for solar ready. So now as a new detached 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses are permitted in the city, they will have to accede to the solar ready provisions in the International Energy Conservation Code. And during construction, just a few changes to make a building solar ready is really not an appreciable expense. And so I think that's a good reform.
Sorry, quick question on the solar ready. And I'm sorry that I am not familiar with the solar ready. I know that you called it an annex. I think it's part of like the stretch codes that the state has adopted. So with solar ready, do you have any idea if the developer, the home builder, is not only encouraged to make sure that the roof or the home and the electrical systems of the home are ready for solar panels, or could be, so they could receive those pretty easily, but do they speak to anything about the orientation of the direction that the home is being built? So encouraging south-facing roofs as opposed to east-west orientations.
I don't recall that level of detail. The full text of it's either an annex or appendix, I can't remember which, but the full text is available on the internet. It's the International Energy Conservation Code, It's separate and distinct from stretch code. This is not stretch code. I don't think the stretch code is published or written yet. If it is, I haven't seen it. Okay. Yeah, but this effort is separate and distinct from stretch code. I mentioned earlier that we'll be running a 4th year of geothermal Urbana-Champaign and a 9th year of solar Urbana-Champaign. We had a second planning meeting with mayor and city council for the strategic goals for, we've had those. This is an image from the previous iteration. So we're making plans for the next iteration. Some things that were agreed upon at that meeting and will eventually be part of a document that city council will vote on include supporting solar NGO at city facilities, promoting green stormwater infrastructure, and implementing a grant program that was funded in the current fiscal year that we're more than halfway through, implementing a grant program for community environmental projects. A couple of honorable mentions that were discussed but didn't make the cut. There were, at this last meeting, there were 60 goals that were cut down to 30, I believe was the final number. So a couple of honorable mentions that didn't make the cut. One was supporting food scrap collection and composting, ultimately destined for the Landscape Recycling Center, and funding street tree maintenance. So I'm glad for the ones that made it in. I'm glad for the discussion of the ones that didn't make it in, because that's something we can revisit in the future.
For the community grants, for the grant program with community environmental benefits, does that, when do you anticipate that being something that can be, available then for people to learn more about? My
understanding is that that is on the desk at Grants Management in Community Development. I know it's not, I haven't seen anything made public yet, and so there may be an issue of staff time. I know they were down to one person, and as of a week or two ago, now have 2 people in that division. And this is the division that handles the multi-million-dollar housing and community improvement grants. So it's not nothing to only have one person there. So I think that's probably dependent on when they can get it on their agenda. And then the last thing, I didn't mean to have text there, sorry. We'll be collecting annual data for our next annual report. It's going to be a little bit later than usual. In the past, some of our aggregation data, specifically the renewable energy credits purchasing, that data came, I think it was quarterly because they were retiring our RECs quarterly. The current vendor is retiring our RECs annually, so I may not have that data till mid-March or even the beginning of April. So that report is going to be a little bit later, perhaps a month later than it was last year, but we're pulling that data together. Any questions?
I have some questions when you get a chance.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, the video is delayed. I can't see if someone else is talking or looking at me in the ceiling. Thank you. I have a few questions here. Scott, I didn't catch what you were saying about the municipal aggregate, if you expect the price to go up or down with the change.
So in July, the portion of the price that is not fixed is called the capacity charge. That is set by an auction event, and that charge could go up or down. I haven't heard any indications of what we should expect, so I don't know what that's going to do. It's worth mentioning that last year, collectively, we saved Urbana electric utility ratepayers $3.5 million with aggregation, and this year we've given back about $1 million. So it's the market has been dynamic. So I don't know what that capacity charge is going to do this year. The other thing I mentioned is that contract ends in December, so we will be going out for bid sometime, I suppose, the second half of this calendar year.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate what you said about the honorable mentions of council goals, and would reiterate Scott's point that some of the honorable mentions didn't make the cut just out of a set number of categories and amount of time. But I'll still work on some of those, and that they did have support, just didn't meet some numbers in our system for that day. And that we did have the budget thing last night for the tree staff and solar in the budget, and that was moved on to city council. And I had another question, Scott, and for this one, if you don't want to talk about it now, and if we could talk about it at a later time, if not, I was wondering if you could elaborate on any potentials on the food scrap compost, if SAC did want to recommend revamping that program and working with CCES. You mentioned some things about RFP and potentially with U-Cycle. And again, if you want that to be a later conversation, that's all right.
Well, in terms of the Landscape Recycling Center, we're ready and willing to take the material. We've got the facilities that we got through a grant with help from CCES, and we've got the pricing. We've got the routine down of how to handle it. We're ready to take the material. The gap now is what is the intervention necessary to get a hauler interested in taking that on as a business, and what is the barrier to making it a profitable business? There are generators out there we already know who are willing to pay some amount, and I think the prices that they were charged by the hauler that was in our pilot program seemed reasonable, but I don't know what the barrier is. That hauler stopped participating, and I haven't been able to get a hold of him to get any feedback on why, but I presume that what he was able to charge wasn't covering what it cost to do it at that small capital scale, at that small equipment scale, and that maybe there was a need for scaling up the equipment. That's only my speculation, but I'm willing and ready to work with anybody that can help figure out what that hurdle is to get a hauler interested.
Great. Yeah, and again, that just the point that there's some grant money to potentially leverage, and you had mentioned maybe the city could assist with a request for proposals for haulers with some such incentive.
Sure. Yeah. So if the money that's available is CCES, an independent nonprofit, they don't need to have the city issue an RFP. They could issue an RFP, and I've written quite a few of those in 10 years here, and I'm happy to help with constructing that language with them if they want to go that route with it. That's a possibility. And Luke had a question too. Who's trying to interject?
I was just confirming, is this like household composting?
So what we've been working on with the pilot is commercially generated pre-consumer food scrap. And the reason is that our idea is this: that should be a small number of generators with a large amount of food scrap in a controlled environment. So think about back of house of a restaurant or a grocery store. People have, protocols of what they're doing and how they're doing it, and all they need is to be told, well, here's an additional bucket, and put the food scrap, the trimmings in that bucket, and then that goes in a different can out back. Versus trying to get a large number of people who are generating a small number of food scrap all to put the right thing in and not the wrong thing. So that's our idea of getting at this in a first step in a meaningful way.
Yeah, the USDA is coming up with a new program for reducing food waste. This would fit into that category. Want to do it at any stage in the food chain.
Do you know what they have on offer in this program?
They haven't released it yet, but I
Okay,
know
it's coming.
coming. Yeah.
Okay. Grace, other questions?
No, that's all. Thank you.
All right, are there any other questions about the report from commissioners? Okay, does anyone in the audience have a question or a comment that they want to ask or respond to in response to the presentation?
Maybe they'd like to tell us if they think that this is a good path forward. Perhaps one of them would like to, just sit down next to Scott for a minute and say whether they think that the city should continue in this direction. Maybe. I'm just suggesting. It's very easy to do. We're very friendly people. We just sort of assume that this is what people want, but we can't know from facial and nods. We would love to hear you actually say it. Come on. I'm seeing some maybes back there, so we just give it a minute. I'll hand it back to you, Stacy, and let them make a decision. I'm very intense on pressuring them to come on, just stand up.
All right.
Show of hands.
I remember being very uncomfortable, but it's really not uncomfortable. It's the same as being in a class and answering a question. Just sit next to Scott there.
Yeah, come on up.
You can go to. Great.
Oh,
Is
I
it
could
on?
just take this thing.
There you go.
Well, we're on here on behalf of a class for UP 136, so we are currently having to write kind of going to one of these meetings and having to gauge, okay, what are we going to do within our community? And I live on the Champaign side, so I don't really get to see a lot of this, but being on the Urbanus side, of course, I think it's actually really awesome, the ideas that you have, especially in regards to geothermal. We are actually in an FA 330. We went to go visit a house that was built by Mark Taylor and his team in regards to something like a large scale competition. And the house did include a lot of aspects of geothermal, and hearing the implementation within the fire stations, I think, is actually a great way to begin to go in that direction, especially in regards to a lot of these houses that we look at, especially in this neighborhood, tend to run to be a little bit older. And I think that definitely starting somewhere is a great way to then be like, oh, hey, we can also do this. But there's a lot of great things that come with this. And in even the architectural aspects of talking about adding windows to south facing and all these other implementations, I think is a great way to start incentivizing people to start thinking about the decisions of their architecture of the places in which they live in. And I just think, yeah, it's a great way to start. It's a great way to start, especially as someone who's kind of watching peripherally. It is really a really great idea, and really just, yeah.
I love that. Thank you so much. And that's the Solar Decathlon house. And Andy helped get that geothermal added to it. So it's pertinent not only to the overarching program, but to people right here. Thank you. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much for sharing that input. You did great, by the way. So awesome. Let's see, so just sort of a final announcement this evening is that there's an open seat on the Sustainability Advisory Commission. The requirement is that you must live in Urbana, and there's a very brief application to fill out online. So if you don't live in Urbana, but you have a friend that does and is interested in sustainability, and maybe in the Sustainable Design Program, or urban planning, or an energy studies department at the university, I would invite you to apply.
And there's an open officer's seat as our capable leader for how many years now?
I'm bad at keeping time.
So many years.
Four?
Stacy
5?
Gloss is stepping down from her leadership role as chair. So the chair is open as well. But thank you for your years of service.
Thank you. It has been an enjoyable experience. All right, I
Yeah,
think.
thank you, Stacy.
Give us a chance to tell you.
Oh,
thank you.
no, God, I was gonna.
You're gonna make us all hang up quickly.
We're
You know,
adjourned.
it just as it might be difficult to speak up on behalf of the community somewhat anonymously, it's also very difficult to be in a leadership role of a team looking to try to save the entire planet one city at a time. So I really appreciate everything you've done for this commission, and I am sad to see you step down, but I understand there's always many things to choose from. Thank you, Stacy.
Okay. All right, we're going to go ahead and call this meeting adjourned. There's no further business before the commission this evening. Thank you all so much for attending.